Sometimes the worst storms in life lead us to the most unexpected blessings. When Marcus Thompson found a shivering toddler abandoned in a Chicago blizzard, he had no idea that one act of compassion would uncover a conspiracy worth billions, expose a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of corporate America, and reveal that the child in his arms was the key to bringing down one of the most powerful women in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The homeless veteran thought he was just saving a life that frigid December night. But what Marcus discovered, hidden beneath the city's elite society, was worth more than he could have ever imagined. The real treasure wasn't money, though. It was the truth about a little girl whose disappearance had triggered a desperate cover-up, and a mother whose empire was built on secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. When corporate security forces and federal agents converged on the abandoned warehouse where Marcus had taken shelter, he faced an impossible choice. Trust the system that had failed him as a veteran, or protect the child who had somehow found him in the darkness of the worst night of his life. What would you risk to save an innocent life? The December wind cut through downtown Chicago like a blade made of ice and fury, turning the streets into frozen rivers that only the desperate dared to navigate. Marcus Thompson pulled his threadbare army surplus jacket tighter around his shoulders and pressed deeper into the doorway of the abandoned Brewster Building, watching the blizzard transform the city into something alien and hostile. At 47, Marcus carried himself like a man who had learned that survival was a daily negotiation with circumstances beyond his control. 3 years of living on Chicago's streets had taught him to read the weather, the people, and the dangers that moved through the urban landscape like predators hunting for weakness. His weathered face bore the map of hard choices and harder consequences, but his eyes still held the alertness of someone who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and understood that vigilance was the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming another statistic. The Brewster Building had been his sanctuary for the past 6 months, a 20-story monument to Chicago's industrial past that now stood empty except for the ghosts of prosperity and the occasional homeless veteran who needed shelter from the elements. The building's ground floor had been stripped of anything valuable years ago, but the upper floors still contained remnants of the offices and manufacturing spaces that had once employed thousands of people. Marcus had made his temporary home on the 7th floor, in what used to be a bookkeeping department, where broken windows had been covered with cardboard and plastic sheeting to keep out the worst of the weather. The storm that night was different from the usual Chicago winter fury. The meteorologists on the radio had called it a once-in-a-decade event, a massive system that had swept down from Canada carrying enough snow and wind to shut down the entire metropolitan area. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero, and the wind chill made it feel like stepping into a freezer that had been set to kill anything foolish enough to venture outside without proper protection. Marcus had spent the day scavenging for food and supplies, hitting the usual spots where restaurant managers sometimes left day-old bread, and the occasional kind-hearted soul would slip him a few dollars or a cup of coffee. He'd managed to collect enough canned goods to last through the storm, along with several newspapers that would serve as insulation and kindling for the small, warming fire he kept in an old metal wastebasket on the 7th floor. The wind howled through the building's broken windows and damaged facade, creating a symphony of whistles and moans that would have been unsettling to someone who hadn't spent years learning to sleep through artillery fire and the sounds of war. Marcus had developed the soldier's ability to find rest in even the most challenging circumstances, but tonight something felt different. The storm seemed angrier than usual, more personal somehow, as if nature itself was trying to settle a score with the city. As he climbed the darkened stairwell toward his makeshift shelter, Marcus heard something that stopped him cold on the 4th floor landing. It was faint at first, almost lost in the cacophony of wind and creaking metal, but unmistakable once he focused his attention. A child was crying somewhere in the building, the thin wail of someone very young and very frightened cutting through the storm noise like a distress signal. Marcus set down his bag of supplies and listened carefully, using the tracking skills that had kept him alive in the mountains of Afghanistan. The crying was coming from below, probably the 2nd floor, and it had the desperate quality of someone who had been calling for help for a long time without receiving an answer. Every instinct Marcus had developed as both a soldier and a father told him that a child was in serious danger. He descended the stairs quickly but quietly, his military training taking over as he moved through the darkened building. The crying grew louder as he reached the second floor, and Marcus could hear that it was definitely a small child, probably a toddler based on the pitch and rhythm of the distress call. The sound was coming from what had once been the building's main reception area, a large space near the front entrance that was now filled with debris and broken furniture. Marcus found her huddled behind an overturned desk, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3 years old, wearing a pink winter coat that was far too thin for the brutal Chicago weather. She was shivering so violently that Marcus could hear her teeth chattering from across the room, and her lips had taken on the bluish tinge that he recognized as the early stages of hypothermia. The child looked up at him with eyes that were wide with fear and exhaustion, tears frozen on her cheeks like tiny crystals. "Hey there, sweetheart," Marcus said softly, crouching down to the child's level and keeping his voice as gentle as possible. "It's okay. I'm here to help you. What's your name?" The little girl stared at him for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether this strange man represented safety or another source of danger. Finally, in a voice that was barely above a whisper, she managed to say, "Emma, I want my mommy." Marcus felt his heart break a little at the words. He'd heard that same plea from children in Afghan villages who had been separated from their families by war and circumstances beyond their control. The desperation in a child's voice when they called for their mother was one of the most heartbreaking sounds in the world, and it never got easier to hear. "Emma's a beautiful name," Marcus said, slowly extending his hand toward the child. "I'm Marcus, and I'm going to help you find your mommy, okay? But first, we need to get you somewhere warm, because you're very cold right now." Emma studied his face with the solemn intensity that very young children brought to important decisions. Something in Marcus's expression must have convinced her that he was trustworthy, because she reached out with a tiny hand that was ice cold to the touch and allowed him to help her stand up. She was even smaller than he'd initially thought, probably closer to 2.5 than 3, and she moved with the unsteady gait of someone who was fighting off the early effects of exposure. Marcus scooped Emma into his arms, feeling how light she was, how fragile, and immediately began calculating what he needed to do to keep her alive. The child was seriously hypothermic, her body temperature dangerously low, and she needed warmth, food, and medical attention as quickly as possible. His first aid training from the army told him that he had maybe an hour to get her core temperature up before the situation became life-threatening. We're going to go. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. "Upstairs to my place," Marcus told Emma as he carried her toward the stairwell. "I've got a nice warm fire up there and some food, and we'll get you all warmed up while we figure out how to find your mommy." Emma nodded weakly and rested her head against Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of trust that reminded him painfully of his own daughter Sophia, who would have been about Emma's age if she had lived. Marcus had lost Sophia and her mother in a car accident while he was deployed overseas, a tragedy that had contributed to the downward spiral that eventually led him to the streets of Chicago. Holding Emma brought back memories that were both precious and devastating, but also awakened protective instincts that he hadn't felt in years. The climb to the 7th floor took longer than usual, because Marcus was carrying Emma and trying to keep her as warm as possible while navigating the darkened stairwell. By the time they reached his improvised shelter, Emma had stopped shivering, which Marcus recognized as a bad sign. When the body stopped generating heat through shivering, it meant that hypothermia was advancing to a dangerous stage. Marcus's shelter was sparse but functional. He'd arranged several layers of cardboard and salvaged blankets to create a sleeping area, and he'd positioned his metal wastebasket fire pit in the center of the space to provide maximum warmth, while ensuring adequate ventilation through the broken windows. A collection of canned goods and bottled water represented his food supply, and he'd salvaged some basic tools and a battery-powered radio from various locations around the building. Marcus quickly added more newspaper and cardboard to his fire, building it up to generate as much heat as possible without creating a safety hazard. Then he wrapped Emma in every blanket he had, creating a cocoon of warmth around the tiny child. She was barely conscious now, her eyes fluttering as her body tried to conserve energy by shutting down non-essential functions. "Stay with me, Emma," Marcus said, rubbing her hands and feet to stimulate circulation. "You're going to be okay. I've got you now, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Marcus opened a can of soup and heated it over his fire, then patiently fed Emma small spoonfuls of the warm broth. The child was too weak to eat much, but the warm liquid helped to raise her core temperature gradually. Marcus had learned in the army that rapid rewarming could be dangerous for hypothermia victims, so he took his time, monitoring Emma's condition carefully and adjusting his treatment based on her responses. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Marcus found himself wondering how a small child had ended up alone in an abandoned building during the worst blizzard Chicago had seen in years. Emma's clothes, while inadequate for the weather, were clearly expensive. Her pink coat bore the logo of a high-end children's boutique, and her shoes were the kind that cost more than Marcus spent on food in a month. This wasn't a child from the streets, or from the kind of desperate circumstances that Marcus was familiar with. When Emma finally warmed up enough to speak coherently, Marcus began asking gentle questions about her family and how she had ended up in the building. The answers he received were fragmentary and confusing, filtered through the limited vocabulary and understanding of a very young child, but they painted a picture that troubled Marcus deeply. Emma talked about living in a big house, with lots of rooms and people who worked for her mommy. She mentioned car rides with men in suits and trips on airplanes to places where her mommy had important meetings. Most concerning, Emma described being taken from her bed in the middle of the night by people she didn't recognize, and being driven through the snow to the big empty building where Marcus had found her. "The scary man said Mommy would come get me," Emma explained, her words slightly slurred from exhaustion. "But she didn't come, and it got so cold and dark." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Chicago winter. Someone had deliberately abandoned this child in a place where she was almost certain to die from exposure. This wasn't a case of a child wandering away from home or getting lost in the storm. This was attempted murder disguised as kidnapping, and Marcus was now the only thing standing between Emma and whoever had tried to kill her. Marcus spent the rest of the night keeping Emma warm and trying to piece together the fragments of information she had provided. He'd assumed that the morning would bring opportunities to contact the authorities and reunite Emma with her family, but as dawn broke over the snow-covered city, Marcus began to realize that the situation was far more complicated and dangerous than he'd initially understood. The storm had knocked out power to most of downtown Chicago, and the few radio stations that were still broadcasting reported that the city was essentially shut down. Emergency services were overwhelmed, and the police were only responding to the most critical calls. Even if Marcus could find a way to contact the authorities, he wasn't sure that turning Emma over to the system would actually protect her from whoever had tried to kill her. Marcus had his own complicated relationship with authority figures and government agencies. As a veteran struggling with PTSD and homelessness, he'd learned that the systems designed to help people like him were often underfunded, understaffed, and unable to provide the kind of support that actually made a difference in people's lives. More troubling, Marcus had encountered enough corruption and indifference in his dealings with bureaucrats to question whether involving the official channels would actually serve Emma's best interests. Emma woke up around mid-morning, much more alert and responsive than she'd been during the night. The warm food and shelter had probably saved her life, but Marcus could see that she was still weak and traumatized by her ordeal. She clung to Marcus like a lifeline, clearly terrified of being abandoned again, and she flinched whenever she heard unexpected sounds from outside the building. "Are you feeling better, sweetheart?" Marcus asked, offering Emma some crackers and juice that he'd saved from his emergency supplies. Emma nodded solemnly and accepted the food, eating with the careful attention of someone who had recently learned what it felt like to be truly hungry. "Is my mommy coming to get me?" she asked, looking up at Marcus with eyes that held far too much worry for someone so young. Marcus chose his words carefully. "I'm going to help you find your mommy, Emma, but it might take a little while because of the big storm outside. Until then, you're going to stay with me, and I'm going to make sure you're safe." The promise felt both natural and terrifying. Marcus had barely been able to take care of himself for the past 3 years, and now he was responsible for protecting a child who was clearly at the center of something dangerous and complicated. But looking at Emma's trusting face, Marcus knew that he would do whatever was necessary to keep her safe, even if it meant putting his own survival at risk. As the day progressed and the storm began to weaken, Marcus started hearing sounds from the lower floors of the building that suggested they were no longer alone. Footsteps echoed through the stairwells, and occasionally he could hear muffled voices speaking in tones too low to understand, but urgent enough to suggest that someone was conducting a systematic search of the building. Marcus gathered Emma into his arms and moved to a window that provided a view of the street below. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Several black SUVs were parked outside the building, their engines running and their windows tinted dark enough to conceal the occupants. These weren't police vehicles or emergency responders. They had the look of private security, the kind of people who worked for corporations or wealthy individuals who needed problems solved quietly and efficiently. "Emma," Marcus said quietly, "I need you to be very brave for me, okay? There are some people downstairs who might not be very nice, and we need to stay hidden from them. Can you do that for me?" Emma nodded with the seriousness of a child who had already learned that the world contained dangers she didn't understand. Marcus gathered his most essential supplies into a backpack, then lifted Emma onto his shoulders and began moving toward the building's rear stairwell. His years of military training had taught him the value of having multiple exit strategies, and he'd spent months learning every route through the Brewster Building. The search team below was methodical but not particularly subtle. Marcus could hear them calling out instructions to each other as they cleared each floor, and their movements suggested they were professionals who were familiar with urban search operations. They weren't trying to be quiet, which meant they weren't worried about attracting attention from law enforcement or neighbors. That level of confidence suggested they had official sanction for whatever they were doing, or enough power to operate without worrying about consequences. Marcus reached the building's service elevator shaft, which had been out of order for years but provided access to a maintenance tunnel that connected to the building's basement and the city's utility corridors. It wasn't a pleasant route, but it would allow Marcus and Emma to exit the building without being seen by the search team. As they descended through the narrow passages, Marcus could hear Emma's quiet breathing and feel her small hands gripping his jacket. The child was being incredibly brave, trusting Marcus to lead her to safety, even though she had no real reason to believe that he was capable of protecting her from whatever forces were arrayed against them. They emerged from the utility tunnels 3 blocks away from the Brewster Building, in the basement of an abandoned restaurant that Marcus had used as a secondary shelter during particularly harsh weather. From there, Marcus could see the black SUVs and observe the search team's activities without being detected. What he witnessed over the next hour convinced him that Emma was in far more danger than he'd initially realized. The search team wasn't just looking for Emma. They were systematically destroying any evidence that she had been in the building. Marcus watched as they brought in equipment that looked like it was designed to eliminate forensic traces. And he saw them removing items from the second-floor area where he'd found Emma. These people weren't just trying to recover a missing child. They were cleaning up after a failed operation, erasing any proof that Emma had been abandoned in the building to die. When the search team finally left, Marcus waited another hour before venturing back onto the streets. Chicago was slowly beginning to dig out from the blizzard, and emergency crews were working to restore power and clear the main transportation routes. But Marcus knew that he and Emma couldn't simply blend back into normal city life. Whoever had tried to kill Emma had significant resources and professional expertise, and they would continue looking for her until they finished what they'd started. Marcus found a 24-hour diner that was one of the few businesses still operating despite the storm, and he used the payphone there to call the only person he trusted enough to ask for help. Jerry Kowalski had served with Marcus in Afghanistan and had managed to successfully transition back to civilian life after his discharge. Jerry worked as a private investigator in Chicago, specializing in cases involving veterans and military families, and he was one of the few people who understood the challenges that Marcus faced as a homeless veteran with PTSD. "Jerry, it's Marcus Thompson. I need your help with something, and it's complicated." Jerry's voice was cautious but not unfriendly. "Marcus, man, where have you been? I haven't heard from you in months. Are you okay?" Marcus glanced at Emma, who was sitting in the diner booth coloring on napkins with crayons that the waitress had provided. The normalcy of the scene was almost surreal given the circumstances they'd escaped from just hours earlier. "I'm okay for now, but I've got a situation. I found a kid last night during the storm, a little girl who was abandoned in an empty building and left to die. Someone tried to kill her, Jerry, and they've got resources. Professional resources." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Marcus, you need to call the police. This isn't something you can handle on your own." "I can't trust the police with this. The people looking for her have too much power, too much reach. They cleaned up the crime scene like they had official backing. This little girl needs protection from someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Marcus could hear Jerry sighing heavily. "Tell me where you are. I'll come pick you up, and we'll figure out what to do next." "But Marcus, you have to understand that harboring a missing child could land you in prison, even if your intentions are good." "She's not missing, Jerry. She was kidnapped and left to die. There's a difference." Marcus gave Jerry the diner's address and settled in to wait, knowing that he was about to cross a line that would change his life forever. Up until now, he'd been a victim of circumstances, a casualty of war and economic hardship who was just trying to survive from day to day. But protecting Emma meant becoming an active participant in whatever conspiracy had nearly claimed her life, and Marcus had no illusions about the dangers the choice would bring. Emma looked up from her coloring and smiled at Marcus with the uncomplicated trust that children reserve for the adults who made them feel safe. In that moment, Marcus knew that he would face whatever consequences came from his decision to protect her, because some things were more important than personal safety or convenience. Jerry Kowalski arrived at the diner 45 minutes later, bringing with him the steady competence that had made him an excellent soldier and an even better investigator. Jerry took one look at Emma and immediately understood that Marcus had stumbled into something far more serious than a simple missing child case. "She's beautiful," Jerry said quietly, settling into the booth across from Marcus and Emma. "But you're right about one thing. Those clothes, that bearing, she's from money. Serious money. The kind of family that makes the news when their children go missing." Marcus nodded grimly. "That's what worries me. If she's from the kind of family that should be able to protect her, then why was she abandoned in an empty building during a blizzard? Someone with significant resources wanted her dead, and they were willing to make it look like an accident." Jerry studied Emma with the analytical eye of someone who had learned to read people in situations quickly and accurately. "Emma, sweetheart, can you tell me about your mommy? What does she do for work?" Emma looked up from her coloring, considering the question with the seriousness that small children brought to adult conversations. "Mommy has meetings with important people. She has a big office with lots of windows, and people bring her papers to sign. Sometimes we go on her airplane to other cities where she talks to more important people." Jerry and Marcus exchanged a look that confirmed their growing suspicions. Emma wasn't just from a wealthy family. She was the daughter of someone with significant political or corporate power, someone whose decisions affected enough people to create enemies willing to commit murder. "Emma," Jerry continued gently, "do you remember your mommy's name? Her full name?" Emma nodded proudly. "Victoria Sterling. She's the most important mommy in the whole world." Jerry went completely still, and Marcus could see the color drain from his friend's face. The name clearly meant something significant, something that explained the professional quality of the search team and the resources that had been deployed to eliminate Emma. "Jerry?" Marcus asked. "What is it? Who is Victoria Sterling?" Jerry leaned back in the booth, running his hands through his hair with the gesture of someone who had just realized that they were in far deeper water than they'd initially understood. "Victoria Sterling," Jerry said quietly, "is the CEO of Sterling Global Industries, one of the largest private corporations in the world. She's worth about $2 billion, controls defense contracts, energy infrastructure, agricultural distribution. She's also one of the most ruthless business leaders in America, with a reputation for eliminating anyone who threatens her empire." Marcus felt the world shift slightly around him. Emma wasn't just a wealthy child who had been targeted by criminals. She was the daughter of one of the most powerful women in America, someone with enough influence to command resources that most people couldn't even imagine. "But why would someone try to kill her own daughter?" Marcus asked, though even as he spoke the words, he began to understand the terrible logic that might drive such a decision. Jerry was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking through the implications of what they discovered. Finally, he looked directly at Marcus and said the words that would change everything. "Because Emma isn't just Victoria Sterling's daughter, she's Victoria Sterling's heir. And if something happened to Emma, then Victoria Sterling would inherit something worth far more than $2 billion. Something that powerful people have been fighting over for decades." Marcus looked at the little girl who was contentedly coloring flowers on her napkins, blissfully unaware that she was at the center of a conspiracy that involved more money and power than most people encountered in their entire lives. Emma had found him in that abandoned building not by accident, but because someone had wanted her to die there, alone and forgotten in the Chicago snow. Now Marcus Thompson, homeless veteran and unlikely guardian, was the only thing standing between Emma and the people who would kill a child to claim an empire worth billions of dollars. Jerry Kowalski's apartment on Chicago's North Side had the functional austerity of someone who had learned to live without excess, but it was warm, secure, and most importantly, invisible to the kind of surveillance networks that Sterling Global Industries could deploy. The three-bedroom unit on the fourth floor of a converted warehouse building served as both Jerry's home and his private investigation office, equipped with computers, communication equipment, and enough security measures to keep casual observers from knowing who came and went. Marcus sat at Jerry's kitchen table with Emma on his lap, watching his friend work through databases and information networks that most civilians never knew existed. Jerry had contacts throughout Chicago's law enforcement community, as well as connections to federal agencies and private security firms that had employed veterans with his particular skill set. If anyone could uncover the truth about Emma's situation without alerting the wrong people, it was Jerry. Emma had fallen asleep against Marcus's chest after finishing a meal of mac and cheese and apple juice, the kind of simple comfort food that children craved when their world had been turned upside down. In sleep, she looked even younger and more vulnerable, her small face peaceful in a way that broke Marcus's heart when he remembered the terror he'd seen in her eyes just hours earlier. "I've got preliminary information on Victoria Sterling," Jerry said, turning his laptop screen so Marcus could see the financial reports and news articles he'd compiled. "And it's worse than I initially thought. Sterling Global Industries isn't just a successful corporation. It's a shadow empire that operates in areas most people don't even know exist." Marcus studied the information Jerry had gathered, trying to make sense of numbers that seemed too large to be real and business relationships that spanned continents. Sterling Global had divisions that manufactured everything from military weapons to agricultural fertilizers, with subsidiary companies that controlled shipping routes, energy distribution networks, and telecommunications infrastructure throughout the developing world. "She's not just wealthy," Jerry continued. "She's essentially operating her own private intelligence service. Sterling Global has contracts with governments that most Americans have never heard of, and they've been involved in regime changes, resource extraction deals, and economic development projects that have reshaped entire regions." The scope of Victoria Sterling's influence was staggering. According to Jerry's research, Sterling Global employed over 200,000 people worldwide, operated in 67 countries, and had annual revenues that exceeded the gross domestic product of most nations. Victoria Sterling didn't just run a business. She commanded a global network that could influence elections, manipulate commodity prices, and determine the economic fate of entire populations. "But here's where it gets really interesting," Jerry said, pulling up a different set of documents. "Victoria Sterling didn't inherit this empire. She built it from nothing over the past 15 years, using investment capital that came from sources that are still classified by multiple intelligence agencies." Marcus looked up from the financial reports, recognizing the implications of what Jerry had discovered. "You're saying she's a front for someone else? That Sterling Global is actually controlled by people who prefer to remain invisible?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Victoria Sterling is brilliant, ruthless, and incredibly capable. But nobody builds a $2 billion empire that quickly, without help from organizations that have resources most people can't access. Intelligence agencies, international banking cartels, maybe even foreign governments that want to influence American policy without leaving fingerprints." The revelation cast Emma's attempted murder in an entirely different light. If Victoria Sterling was the visible face of a shadow organization, then Emma represented more than just an inheritance. She was a potential weakness in a carefully constructed facade, a human connection that could be exploited by enemies who wanted to bring down the entire network. "Think about it," Jerry continued, warming to his analysis. "Victoria Sterling has spent 15 years building relationships with people who eliminate problems rather than negotiate solutions. If Emma was kidnapped and threatened, Victoria would be forced to choose between protecting her daughter and protecting the empire that gives her power. But if Emma simply disappeared during a blizzard, died from exposure in an abandoned building, then Victoria could grieve publicly while maintaining her position. Marcus felt sick as he understood the cold calculation behind Emma's abandonment. Someone had concluded that Emma was more valuable dead than alive, that her death would strengthen Victoria Sterling's position rather than weakening it. The people who had left Emma in that building hadn't been motivated by greed or revenge. They had been implementing a strategic decision designed to eliminate a liability. Who would make that kind of decision? Marcus asked. Who has the authority to order the death of Victoria Sterling's daughter? Jerry's expression was grim as he pulled up photographs of men in expensive suits standing beside Victoria Sterling at various corporate events and political gatherings. These are the people who appear most frequently with Sterling at public functions. Board members, business partners, political allies. Any one of them could have concluded that Emma represented an unacceptable risk to their collective interests. Marcus studied the faces of men who looked like they belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. People who made decisions about billions of dollars and thousands of lives from behind mahogany desks in climate-controlled offices. They had the soft appearance of individuals who had never personally experienced violence or deprivation, but who were comfortable ordering others to commit acts they would never dirty their own hands with. Emma stirred in Marcus's arms, making the small sounds that children made when they were transitioning between sleep and wakefulness. Marcus adjusted his position to make her more comfortable, and she settled back into peaceful rest without fully waking. The trust she showed in Marcus was both heartwarming and terrifying, because he knew that he was probably the only person in the world who was genuinely committed to protecting her. "There's something else," Jerry said, lowering his voice even though Emma was asleep. "I've been monitoring police communications and federal law enforcement channels since you called me. There's been no missing person report filed for Emma Sterling. No Amber Alert, no FBI involvement, nothing that would suggest that Victoria Sterling is looking for her missing daughter." The implications of Jerry's discovery were chilling. Either Victoria Sterling didn't know that Emma was missing, which seemed impossible given the resources at her disposal, or she was deliberately avoiding official channels that would create a public record of Emma's disappearance. Either way, it suggested that Emma's safety was not Victoria Sterling's top priority. "Maybe she's conducting her own search using private security," Marcus suggested, though he didn't really believe it himself. "Maybe she doesn't trust law enforcement to handle something this sensitive." Jerry shook his head. "I've got contacts in the private security industry, and nobody's been hired for a missing child recovery operation. The only activity I can detect is cleanup operations. The kind of work that gets done after a problem has been permanently resolved." Marcus looked down at Emma's sleeping face and felt a surge of protective anger that reminded him of his time in Afghanistan, when he'd encountered children who had been abandoned or threatened by adults who were supposed to care for them. The fundamental injustice of endangering someone so innocent and helpless triggered responses in Marcus that went deeper than rational thought. "We need to find out what Emma knows," Marcus said quietly. "She's too young to understand the details, but she might have seen or heard things that would help us identify who took her and why." Jerry nodded agreement, but his expression remained troubled. "Marcus, you need to understand what you're getting into here. If Victoria Sterling and her associates are willing to kill a child to protect their interests, they won't hesitate to eliminate a homeless veteran who's interfering with their plans. Once we start digging deeper into this, there's no going back to anonymity." Marcus had already considered the personal risks, but holding Emma in his arms made the calculation simple. He'd failed to protect his own daughter, but he wouldn't fail Emma. Whatever consequences came from challenging Victoria Sterling's empire, Marcus was prepared to face them. "I've been invisible for 3 years," Marcus said. "Living on the streets, ignored by everyone who might have helped me rebuild my life. Maybe it's time to be visible again, even if it's dangerous." Jerry spent the next several hours teaching Marcus how to communicate securely, how to avoid surveillance, and how to access resources that wouldn't leave digital footprints that Sterling Global could track. The skills were similar to what Marcus had learned in the military, but adapted for urban environments and corporate rather than military opponents. Emma woke up in the early evening, refreshed and more alert than she'd been since Marcus found her. Jerry had stocked his apartment with children's clothes and toys, anticipating that Emma might need to stay with them for several days while they developed a plan for her protection. Emma accepted the new environment with the adaptability that young children showed when they trusted the adults caring for them. "Emma," Jerry said gently, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "Marcus told me that some scary people took you from your house. Can you tell me about that? What do you remember?" Emma considered the question with the seriousness that she brought to all adult inquiries. "I was sleeping in my room with Princess Buttercup," she said, referring to what Marcus assumed was a stuffed animal or pet. "Then the door opened and people came in who I didn't know. They said Mommy wanted to see me, but they didn't look like Mommy's helpers." Jerry and Marcus exchanged glances. Emma's account suggested that the kidnapping had been carefully planned, with the perpetrators gaining access to the Sterling residence and Emma's bedroom, without triggering security systems that undoubtedly protected one of the wealthiest women in America. "What did these people look like?" Jerry asked. "Were they men or women, old or young?" Emma scrunched up her face as she tried to remember details that had probably been confusing and frightening when they occurred. "Two men. One was big and had a scary voice. The other one was smaller and kept looking at his phone. They put me in a car and drove for a long time." "Do you remember anything about the car? What color it was, or what it looked like inside?" "It was black and very clean. And it smelled like the spray that cleaning ladies use at our house. But it was different from Mommy's cars because it didn't have the special seats." Marcus realized that Emma was describing a vehicle that had been professionally cleaned to eliminate forensic evidence, but which lacked the customized features that Victoria Sterling would have insisted on for her personal transportation. The kidnappers had used a generic luxury vehicle, probably rented or stolen specifically for the operation. "Emma, this is very important," Jerry continued patiently. "When they took you to the big building where Marcus found you, did they say anything about why you were there? Did they mention your mommy or anyone else?" Emma's expression grew sad as she remembered the abandonment that had nearly cost her life. "The scary man said Mommy would come get me soon, but first I had to wait in the building because it was a special place. But then they left and it got dark and cold, and Mommy never came." Jerry sat back on his heels, processing Emma's account and comparing it to what he'd learned about Sterling Global's operations. The kidnapping had been executed with professional competence, but the abandonment had been designed to look like an accident. If Marcus hadn't found Emma, she would have died from exposure, and the death would have appeared to be the result of a kidnapping gone wrong rather than a deliberate murder. "There's one more thing I need to ask you, sweetheart," Jerry said. "At your house, do you remember if your mommy seemed worried about anything lately? Did she have meetings with people who made her upset, or did she seem scared about something?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Mommy was crying after her phone calls, and she had a big meeting with angry men who shouted at her. She told Nanny Sarah that the angry men wanted to take away our house and our airplane and make Mommy work for them instead of being the boss." Jerry and Marcus looked at each other with growing understanding. Emma had described what sounded like a hostile takeover attempt, a corporate power struggle in which Victoria Sterling was fighting to maintain control of her empire against adversaries who were prepared to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. "The kidnappers weren't criminals," Marcus said quietly. "They were corporate operatives. Someone is trying to force Victoria Sterling out of her own company, and they decided that killing Emma would weaken her position enough to make her vulnerable." Jerry nodded grimly. "It's a classic corporate warfare strategy. Identify your opponent's emotional weaknesses and exploit them. Victoria Sterling has built her career on being ruthless and calculating, but everyone knows she has a daughter. If Emma died, Sterling would be devastated, distracted, possibly even mentally unstable. Perfect conditions for a takeover." Marcus felt his anger building as he understood the casual cruelty behind Emma's attempted murder. She hadn't been targeted because of anything she'd done or any threat she represented. She was simply collateral damage in a business dispute between people who measured success in billions of dollars and considered human lives as acceptable losses. Emma wandered over to Marcus and climbed into his lap, seeking the comfort and security that she'd learned to associate with his presence. Marcus wrapped his arms around her and made a silent promise that he would protect her from the people who saw her as nothing more than a strategic asset to be eliminated. "We need to find out who's behind the takeover attempt," Marcus said. "And we need to figure out why Victoria Sterling hasn't reported Emma missing or launched her own investigation." Jerry was already turning back to his computer, pulling up corporate filings and financial reports that might reveal who was moving against Sterling Global Industries. I'll start with recent stock transactions and board meeting minutes. Hostile takeovers usually leave paper trails, especially when they involve companies as large as Sterling Global. Marcus watched Jerry work while Emma dozed against his chest, and he found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken over the past 24 hours. Yesterday he'd been a forgotten casualty of war and economic hardship, someone whose death would have gone unnoticed by anyone except the social workers, who would have eventually filed the paperwork. Today he was the guardian of a child whose life was worth billions of dollars to some people, and whose death was worth even more to others. The transformation felt both surreal and oddly familiar. In Afghanistan, Marcus had learned that combat situations could change a person's role and responsibilities in a matter of seconds. One moment you were following orders and trying to stay alive, and the next moment you were making life-and-death decisions that affected the survival of everyone around you. Protecting Emma required the same kind of instant adaptation to circumstances that were beyond his control. Jerry's research began yielding results as the evening progressed. He discovered that Sterling Global Industries had been the subject of intense scrutiny from financial analysts and corporate raters for several months, with multiple parties expressing interest in acquiring the company's most valuable assets. The pressure had intensified recently, with several major institutional investors questioning Victoria Sterling's leadership and demanding changes to the company's board of directors. "Here's what I think is happening," Jerry said, showing Marcus a timeline of recent corporate events. Victoria Sterling has been fighting a multi-front war against people who want to break up her company and sell off the pieces. She's been winning, but barely, and her opponents have been getting increasingly desperate. Marcus studied the financial documents that Jerry had compiled, trying to understand the complex web of business relationships and corporate maneuvering that had led to Emma's kidnapping. The amounts of money involved were staggering, with individual transactions worth more than most people earned in their entire lives. 6 weeks ago, Jerry continued, Sterling Global announced a major acquisition that would have made them virtually impossible to challenge. They were going to purchase Meridian Defense Systems, a military contractor with exclusive relationships to several government agencies. The combined company would have been too big and too strategically important for anyone to successfully attack. Marcus could see where Jerry's analysis was leading. But something went wrong with the acquisition. The deal fell through at the last minute, allegedly because of regulatory concerns. But I think the real reason was sabotage. Someone with enough influence to affect government policy decisions intervened to block the merger, leaving Sterling Global vulnerable to the kind of corporate assault they're facing now. The scope of the conspiracy against Victoria Sterling was becoming clearer, and it extended far beyond simple business competition. Her opponents had government connections, intelligence resources, and the kind of institutional power that could influence regulatory decisions and policy implementation. They weren't just trying to acquire a profitable company, they were dismantling a threat to their own economic and political interests. Emma stirred in Marcus's arms and looked up at him with the trusting expression that had become familiar over the past day. "Marcus, when can I go home to see Mommy?" The question pierced Marcus's heart, because he didn't have an answer that would comfort her. Based on what they'd learned, Victoria Sterling might not even be looking for Emma, either because she didn't know Emma was missing, or because she'd concluded that Emma was already dead. Either possibility meant that reuniting Emma with her mother would be far more complicated and dangerous than Marcus had initially imagined. "We're going to find your mommy, sweetheart," Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. "But first, we need to make sure it's safe for you to go home. Some bad people have been trying to hurt you and your mommy, and we need to stop them before they can try again." Emma accepted this explanation with the matter-of-fact understanding that children showed when the adults they trusted told them difficult truths. She'd already experienced enough fear and uncertainty to understand that the world contained dangers that she couldn't control or fully comprehend. Jerry's phone rang, interrupting their conversation with the harsh electronic sound that signaled urgent communication. Jerry glanced at the caller ID and frowned, recognizing a number that he'd programmed for emergency situations. "This is Detective Maria Santos," Jerry explained to Marcus as he answered the call. "She's one of my contacts in the Chicago Police Department, someone who helps me with cases involving veterans and military families." Marcus watched Jerry's expression change as he listened to whatever Detective Santos was telling him. The conversation was brief, conducted in the kind of coded language that law enforcement professionals used when they suspected their communications might be monitored. "We have a problem," Jerry said after ending the call. "Detective Santos says there's been unusual activity in the police database. Someone with high-level access has been running searches for information related to missing children, abandoned building investigations, and homeless veteran services. The searches started about 6 hours ago, and they're coming from federal agencies that don't normally interface with local law enforcement." Marcus felt the familiar chill of recognition that he'd learned to associate with imminent danger. Someone with significant resources was systematically searching for evidence of Emma's rescue, using government databases and law enforcement networks to track their movements. "They know Emma survived," Marcus said. "And they know someone helped her." Jerry nodded grimly. "Detective Santos thinks we have maybe 12 hours before they connect the database searches to your identity and track us to this location. After that, we'll be dealing with federal agents who have the authority to arrest us for interfering with an ongoing investigation." Marcus looked at Emma, who was playing quietly with the toys Jerry had provided, blissfully unaware that her rescue had triggered a manhunt by people with virtually unlimited resources and legal authority. The innocent picture she presented made the threats surrounding her seem even more obscene and unjust. "What are our options?" Marcus asked. Jerry was already moving toward a closet where he kept emergency supplies and equipment for situations that required rapid departure. "We can try to stay ahead of the search, keep moving, and hope they don't have enough information to track us effectively. Or we can go on the offensive, try to expose the people who are after Emma before they can eliminate all the evidence." Marcus considered the alternatives, weighing the risks of flight against the dangers of confrontation. Running would keep Emma temporarily safe, but it would also ensure that the people trying to kill her would eventually succeed. They had too many resources and too much institutional support to be evaded indefinitely. Fighting back offered the possibility of permanent resolution, but it also meant putting Emma directly in the path of even greater dangers. "There's a third option," Marcus said slowly, as an idea began forming in his mind. "We could try to contact Victoria Sterling directly, bypass her security and corporate structure to warn her about the conspiracy against her daughter." Jerry paused in his packing to consider Marcus's suggestion. "That's incredibly risky. If Sterling is involved in the plot against Emma, then contacting her would be suicide. And even if she's innocent, approaching her directly would expose our location and give her enemies the opportunity to eliminate all of us." Marcus understood the risks, but he also recognized that they were running out of alternatives that didn't involve putting Emma in even greater danger. Emma deserves to know the truth about her mother, and Victoria Sterling deserves the chance to protect her daughter if she's capable of doing so. The decision would determine not just their immediate survival, but the kind of people they chose to be in a situation where no perfect choices existed. Marcus looked at Emma, who was humming quietly to herself as she arranged toy animals in careful patterns, and realized that some risks were worth taking when the alternative was allowing evil to triumph through inaction. Jerry finished packing their emergency supplies and turned to face Marcus with the expression of someone who had made peace with a dangerous decision. "If we're going to contact Victoria Sterling, we need to do it in a way that doesn't get us all killed in the process. I know someone who might be able to help us reach her safely." Marcus lifted Emma into his arms and prepared to leave the temporary safety of Jerry's apartment for the unknown dangers that waited outside. Whatever happened next, he was committed to seeing this through to the end. Because Emma's life was worth more than any empire, and some battles were too important to avoid. The safe house that Jerry's contact provided was a converted warehouse in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, tucked between a legitimate auto repair shop and a family-owned bakery that had been serving the community for 3 generations. From the outside, the building looked like countless other industrial structures that dotted the city's working-class neighborhoods, unremarkable enough to escape notice from surveillance teams or federal agents conducting systematic searches. Marcus carried Emma through the building's rear entrance while Jerry handled the security protocols that would keep their location hidden from the sophisticated tracking systems that Sterling Global's enemies were undoubtedly deploying. The interior of the safe house revealed itself to be far more sophisticated than its humble exterior suggested, with communication equipment, computer terminals, and defensive measures that rivaled anything Marcus had seen during his military service. The woman who met them inside introduced herself simply as Anna, though Marcus suspected that wasn't her real name. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had spent years operating in environments where mistakes could be fatal, and her eyes held the watchful intelligence that Marcus recognized in veteran operatives who had survived longer than statistics suggested they should have. "Jerry tells me you've stumbled into something involving Victoria Sterling," Anna said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "That makes you either very lucky or very dead, depending on how the next few hours play out." Emma had fallen asleep during the car ride to the safe house, exhausted by the stress and uncertainty that had dominated her life for the past 2 days. Marcus settled her onto a couch that Anna had prepared with blankets and pillows, then joined Jerry and Anna at a table where detailed maps of Chicago were spread alongside photographs of corporate executives and government officials. "Before we go any further," Anna continued, "you need to understand what you're really dealing with. Victoria Sterling isn't just another wealthy CEO who got caught up in corporate politics. She's the linchpin in a network that connects American intelligence agencies, international banking systems, and foreign governments in ways that most people couldn't imagine." Marcus studied the photographs that Anna had arranged on the table, recognizing some faces from news broadcasts and political coverage, but seeing them now in a context that revealed connections and relationships that were never discussed in public forums. The web of influence that surrounded Victoria Sterling extended into every major institution that shaped American policy and global economics. Sterling Global Industries is what intelligence professionals call a nexus organization, Anna explained. It exists at the intersection of legitimate business operations and classified government activities. Victoria Sterling has been managing this dual role for 15 years, balancing the demands of shareholders and board members against the requirements of intelligence agencies and political officials who use her company as a front for operations that can't be conducted through official channels. Jerry was taking notes on a legal pad, sketching out organizational charts that mapped the relationships between Sterling Global and the various government agencies that appeared to influence its operations. So Emma's kidnapping wasn't just about a corporate takeover. It was about control of an intelligence asset. Anna nodded approvingly. "Exactly. Victoria Sterling's enemies aren't just business competitors. They're representatives of factions within the intelligence community who want to restructure how American covert operations are funded and managed. Eliminating Emma would destabilize Victoria emotionally and politically, making her vulnerable to pressure from people who want to use Sterling Global for their own purposes." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving not just corporate raiders and foreign operatives, but elements within the American government itself, who saw Victoria Sterling as either an asset to be controlled or an obstacle to be removed. Emma's attempted murder was part of a power struggle that could reshape how the United States conducted intelligence operations worldwide. Marcus looked at Emma sleeping peacefully on the couch, her small face relaxed in the way that only children could achieve when they felt completely safe. The contrast between her innocence and the international conspiracy swirling around her was almost impossible to comprehend. "What's Victoria Sterling's position in all this?" Marcus asked. "Is she fighting to protect her independence, or is she already compromised?" Anna pulled out a tablet computer and showed Marcus a series of encrypted communications that had been intercepted over the past 72 hours. "That's what we're trying to determine. Sterling's been sending coded messages to contacts in Europe and Asia, but we can't tell if she's coordinating her own defense or following instructions from handlers who control her operations." The messages were brief and cryptic, filled with references to financial transactions and personnel changes that could have been routine business communications or carefully disguised intelligence directives. Without the proper decryption keys, it was impossible to determine Victoria Sterling's true intentions or loyalties. "There's something else you need to see," Anna said, connecting her tablet to a large monitor that displayed real-time surveillance footage from various locations around Chicago. "The people looking for Emma aren't just using database searches and electronic surveillance. They've deployed physical assets throughout the city, and they're conducting a systematic search of every location where a homeless veteran might seek shelter." Marcus watched the surveillance feeds with growing alarm. Teams of operatives in civilian clothes were methodically checking homeless encampments, abandoned buildings, and social service facilities throughout Chicago. They moved with the coordination and efficiency of military units, but their presence was subtle enough to avoid attracting attention from local law enforcement or media coverage. "They know Emma survived the abandonment," Marcus said, "and they know someone with military training helped her. Anna switched to a different camera feed that showed the Brewster Building where Marcus had found Emma. Federal agents were conducting a forensic investigation of the 7th floor area where Marcus had maintained his shelter, collecting evidence that would undoubtedly lead them to his identity within hours. "We estimate you have 6 hours before they connect your DNA and fingerprints to military records that will give them your complete background," Anna said. "After that, they'll know everything about your service record, your family history, and your psychological profile. They'll be able to predict your behavior and anticipate your decisions." Jerry looked up from his organizational charts with an expression of grim determination. 6 hours to contact Victoria Sterling and convince her to protect her own daughter. If she's genuinely fighting to maintain her independence, she'll want to recover Emma and eliminate the people who tried to kill her. If she's already been compromised, then approaching her will be suicide. Marcus considered their options while watching Emma sleep. Every choice involved risks that could result in her death, but inaction would guarantee that her enemies would eventually succeed in eliminating her. The conspiracy against Victoria Sterling was too well funded and too deeply embedded in government institutions to be defeated by passive resistance. "How do we reach Victoria Sterling without exposing ourselves to her security apparatus?" Marcus asked. Anna smiled for the first time since they'd arrived at the safe house, an expression that suggested she'd been hoping someone would ask that question. "Victoria Sterling is scheduled to attend a charity gala tomorrow night at the Palmer House Hotel. It's a public event with enough security chaos to provide cover for an approach, but intimate enough that we could get close to her without having to penetrate a fortress-level defensive perimeter." The plan that Anna outlined was audacious and dangerous, requiring Marcus to assume the identity of a military contractor with legitimate business connections to Sterling Global Industries. Jerry would provide technical support and emergency extraction capabilities, while Anna would handle security coordination and communications with contacts who could ensure their approach didn't trigger a violent response from Sterling's protection detail. "The charity gala is tomorrow night," Anna continued. "That gives us 18 hours to prepare identities, equipment, and contingency plans for every scenario we can anticipate. It also gives Emma's enemies 18 hours to track us down and eliminate the evidence of their failed operation." Marcus looked at Emma again, knowing that the next day would determine whether she lived to see her 4th birthday or became another casualty in a war that most Americans didn't even know was being fought. The decision to approach Victoria Sterling directly would put Emma in immediate danger, but it also offered the possibility of reuniting her with a mother who might be capable of protecting her. "There's one more thing," Anna said, her voice dropping to a whisper despite the security measures that protected their conversation. "Our intelligence suggests that the charity gala isn't just a social event. It's being used as cover for a meeting between Victoria Sterling and representatives of the factions that are trying to control her company. Tomorrow night might be the final confrontation in a power struggle that's been building for months." Jerry set down his pen and looked directly at Marcus. "So we'll be walking Emma into the middle of the very conspiracy that's trying to kill her. If the meeting goes badly, if Sterling's enemies decide to eliminate all the witnesses, then Emma will be trapped in a room full of people who want her dead." Marcus understood the risks, but he also recognized that they were rapidly running out of alternatives. The systematic search that was closing in on their location would eventually succeed, and Anna's safe house wouldn't remain secure indefinitely against adversaries with government resources and unlimited funding. "Emma deserves to know the truth about her mother," Marcus said finally. "And Victoria Sterling deserves the chance to prove that she's willing to fight for her daughter's life." The preparation for the charity gala infiltration consumed most of the next day, with Anna and Jerry working to create documentation and backstory that would allow Marcus to approach Victoria Sterling without triggering security responses that could endanger Emma. Marcus found himself learning about military contracting procedures, corporate hierarchy protocols, and social dynamics that were completely foreign to his experience as a homeless veteran. Emma spent the day playing with toys that Anna had provided while remaining blissfully unaware of the preparations being made around her. She had accepted Marcus as her primary caregiver with the adaptability that young children showed when their normal routines were disrupted. But Marcus could see signs of stress and confusion in her behavior that reminded him of the child trauma cases he'd encountered during his military service. "Marcus," Emma said during lunch, looking up from the sandwich that Anna had prepared for her, "when I see Mommy tonight, will she be happy or sad?" The question pierced Marcus's heart because he didn't have an answer that would comfort her. Victoria Sterling's reaction to Emma's reappearance would depend on factors that were beyond Marcus's control or understanding. If Sterling was genuinely fighting to protect her independence and her daughter, then the reunion would be joyful. If Sterling had been compromised or coerced into accepting Emma's death, then Emma's survival might represent a threat that Sterling would feel compelled to eliminate. "Your mommy loves you very much," Marcus said carefully, "but she's been very worried about you. And sometimes when people are worried for a long time, they need a little time to understand that everything is going to be okay." Emma accepted this explanation with the trusting faith that children placed in adults who had proven themselves reliable. Marcus hoped that his confidence wasn't misplaced, that Victoria Sterling would prove to be the kind of mother who would sacrifice everything to protect her daughter. As evening approached, Marcus found himself thinking about his own daughter, Sophia, and the ways that loss and guilt had shaped his life for the past 3 years. Protecting Emma had awakened feelings and instincts that he'd thought were permanently buried beneath grief and self-destruction. Whatever happened at the charity gala, Marcus knew that he'd been given an opportunity to honor his daughter's memory by saving another child who needed protection. Anna provided Marcus with a perfectly fitted tuxedo and the kind of accessories that would allow him to blend in among Chicago's social and business elite. The transformation was startling, turning a homeless veteran into someone who could credibly claim to belong at high-end charity events and corporate gatherings. "Remember," Anna said as she made final adjustments to Marcus's appearance, "your cover identity is David Morrison, Executive Vice President of Titan Defense Solutions. You have a legitimate business relationship with Sterling Global, and you're attending the gala to discuss potential contracts for overseas security operations." Jerry handed Marcus a briefcase containing documents that would support his cover story, along with communication devices that would allow Anna to monitor his approach to Victoria Sterling and provide assistance if the situation deteriorated. "The charity gala starts at 7, but Sterling won't arrive until 8:30. That gives you time to establish your presence and identify potential threats before she enters the room." Emma was dressed in a beautiful blue dress that Anna had somehow acquired in her exact size, complete with matching shoes and a small purse that contained toys and snacks to keep her occupied during what would undoubtedly be a stressful evening. She looked like any other wealthy child attending a formal event with her father, which was exactly the impression they needed to create. "Emma, sweetheart," Marcus said, kneeling down to her eye level, "tonight we're going to see your mommy. But there will be a lot of people around, and some of them might not be very nice. I need you to stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you, okay?" Emma nodded solemnly, understanding that this was an important moment, even if she couldn't comprehend the complexities that surrounded it. "Will the scary men be there?" "The ones who took me away." Marcus felt his jaw tighten as he considered the possibility that Emma's kidnappers would be present at the charity gala, either as part of Victoria Sterling's security detail or as representatives of the factions that were trying to control her company. "I don't know, sweetheart. But if they are, I won't let them hurt you. I promise." The Palmer House Hotel was ablaze with lights and activity when Marcus and Emma arrived in the town car that Anna had arranged for their transportation. Wealthy donors and corporate executives were streaming into the hotel's grand ballroom, while security personnel maintained a discreet but visible presence throughout the lobby and entrance areas. Marcus presented his credentials to the registration staff with the confidence of someone who belonged at such events, while Emma clung to his hand and observed the opulent surroundings with the wide-eyed fascination that children showed when encountering luxury beyond their normal experience. The ballroom was spectacular, decorated with flowers and lighting that transformed the space into something magical and otherworldly. Round tables were arranged throughout the room to accommodate the hundreds of guests who would be dining and participating in the charity auction that would raise millions of dollars for various humanitarian causes. Marcus found their assigned table and settled Emma into her chair while scanning the room for potential threats and opportunities. The guests were a mixture of corporate executives, political figures, and social celebrities, the kind of people who shaped policy and public opinion through their wealth and connections, rather than through democratic processes. "Look at all the pretty dresses," Emma whispered to Marcus, her eyes bright with excitement as she observed the elegant gowns worn by the female guests. For a moment, she seemed like any other child attending a special event, rather than the target of an international conspiracy. Marcus was studying the room's security arrangements when he noticed a commotion near the ballroom's main entrance. Victoria Sterling had arrived, and her presence immediately shifted the energy in the room as guests turned to observe one of the most powerful women in America. Victoria Sterling was smaller than Marcus had expected, but she commanded attention through sheer force of personality and the confidence that came from wielding enormous power. She moved through the room with the measured grace of someone who was accustomed to being watched and evaluated, greeting other guests with the practiced charm of a political candidate, while her security detail maintained positions that provided clear sightlines and rapid response capabilities. Marcus felt Emma tense beside him as she recognized her mother across the crowded ballroom. "Mommy," Emma whispered, her voice filled with longing and uncertainty. Victoria Sterling hadn't seen them yet, but Marcus could tell that it was only a matter of time before their presence was noticed by either Sterling herself or the security personnel who were systematically cataloging every guest in the room. The moment of contact was approaching, and Marcus knew that the next few minutes would determine whether Emma would be reunited with her mother or whether they would all become casualties in a conspiracy that had already claimed too many innocent lives. Marcus lifted Emma onto his lap and whispered in her ear, "Are you ready to see Mommy?" Emma nodded bravely, and Marcus began moving through the crowd toward the woman who controlled a $2 billion empire and who might be the only person capable of protecting her daughter from the forces that were arrayed against them. The confrontation that would determine Emma's fate was about to begin, and Marcus could only hope that a mother's love would prove stronger than the political and economic pressures that had already torn their family apart. Marcus approached Victoria Sterling during a brief moment when she was standing relatively alone near the auction display tables, momentarily separated from the corporate executives and political figures who had been competing for her attention throughout the evening. Emma's weight in his arms felt both precious and terrifying, as they drew closer to the woman who could either save them or destroy them. Victoria Sterling looked up as Marcus approached, and her practiced social smile began to form before her eyes focused on the child in his arms. The transformation that crossed her face was instantaneous and devastating, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and raw maternal anguish that stripped away 15 years of corporate training and political calculation. "Emma," Victoria whispered, the single word carrying the weight of a mother's worst fears and most desperate hopes. Emma reached toward her mother with small arms that trembled with excitement and uncertainty. "Mommy, I waited for you, like the scary man said, but you didn't come, and it was so cold." Victoria Sterling took Emma from Marcus's arms with movements that were both gentle and desperate, holding her daughter as if she were a precious object that might disappear if not gripped tightly enough. Tears streamed down Sterling's face as she buried her nose in Emma's hair and whispered apologies that were meant for Emma's ears alone. For several moments, Marcus stood witness to a reunion that was both beautiful and heartbreaking, watching a powerful woman reduced to the most fundamental human emotions by the return of a child she had feared was lost forever. The corporate facade and political armor that Victoria Sterling wore in public crumbled completely as she held her daughter and confirmed that Emma was real, alive, and safe. "Where has she been?" Victoria asked Marcus, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Who are you? How did you find her?" Marcus glanced around the ballroom, noting that the reunion was beginning to attract attention from other guests and, more troubling, from security personnel who were moving closer to investigate the unexpected interaction between Sterling and an unknown guest. "My name is David Morrison," Marcus said, using his cover identity while keeping his voice low enough to avoid being overheard. "I found Emma 2 nights ago during the blizzard. She was abandoned in an empty building, left to die from exposure. Someone wanted her dead, and they tried to make it look like an accident." Victoria Sterling's expression shifted from maternal relief to the cold calculation that had made her one of the most feared business leaders in America. "Abandoned? That's impossible. Emma was kidnapped from our home by professional operatives. This was a ransom situation, not an execution." Marcus felt a chill of recognition as he understood the deception that had been practiced against Victoria Sterling. No ransom demand was ever made. Emma was taken from your home and left in an abandoned building to die. If I hadn't found her, she would have frozen to death, and you would have received her body with a story about a kidnapping gone wrong. Victoria's eyes hardened as she processed the implications of Marcus's revelation. "You're telling me that someone used my daughter's kidnapping as cover for an assassination attempt, that while I was preparing to pay whatever ransom they demanded, they were actually trying to murder her." The realization transformed Victoria Sterling from a grieving mother back into the strategic thinker who had built a global empire through her ability to analyze threats and eliminate obstacles. Marcus could see her mind working through the possibilities, identifying suspects and calculating responses with the methodical precision that had made her legendary in corporate circles. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said urgently, "Emma's life is still in danger. The people who tried to kill her are here, tonight, in this room. They're part of a conspiracy to take control of your company, and they see Emma as a liability that needs to be eliminated." Victoria looked around the ballroom with new eyes, seeing potential enemies among the guests she had considered allies and business partners. "How do you know this? Who told you about the conspiracy?" Marcus was about to respond when he noticed movement near the ballroom service entrances that sent alarm signals through his military-trained instincts. Men in servers' uniforms were taking positions around the perimeter of the room, but their movements and posture suggested training that went far beyond food service requirements. "We need to leave," Marcus said quietly. "Now," before they realized that Emma survived and decide to finish what they started. Victoria Sterling's security detail had noticed the unusual activity as well, and Marcus could see them speaking into concealed microphones while subtly positioning themselves for potential threats. But Victoria was studying Marcus with the penetrating gaze of someone who had learned to evaluate people's motivations and capabilities quickly and accurately. "You're not David Morrison," Victoria said with certainty. "Your documentation might be perfect, but your background is military, not corporate. You move like someone who's been in combat, and you analyze threats like someone who's learned to stay alive in dangerous situations." Marcus realized that attempting to maintain his cover identity would be pointless against someone with Victoria Sterling's resources and experience. "My real name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a homeless veteran who found your daughter during the worst night of her life. Everything else I told you is true." Victoria's expression softened slightly, recognition of something she respected in Marcus's honesty and directness. "Mr. Thompson, if you've saved my daughter's life, then I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. But right now, I need you to trust me to handle this situation." Marcus looked around the ballroom again, noting that the suspicious servers had completed their positioning and were now watching the central area where he, Victoria, and Emma were standing. "Mrs. Sterling, with respect, your security has already been compromised. Someone with access to your household staff and protection protocols arranged Emma's kidnapping. The people you trust might be the same people who are trying to kill her." Victoria Sterling was quiet for a moment, holding Emma close while her analytical mind processed the security implications of Marcus's warning. Finally, she made a decision that would determine whether they would all survive the next hour. "Follow my lead," Victoria said quietly. "We're going to walk toward the service corridor as if we're taking Emma to a quiet area where she can rest. Once we're out of the main ballroom, my personal security team will escort us to a location where we can determine who we can trust." Marcus nodded agreement but kept his attention focused on the suspicious servers who were now clearly watching their movements. As they began walking toward the service corridor, Marcus noticed that several of the men were reaching toward concealed positions beneath their uniforms, preparing to draw weapons that would turn the charity gala into a battlefield. The first shots were fired just as Victoria, Marcus, and Emma reached the corridor entrance, the distinctive crack of suppressed pistols cutting through the background noise of conversation and classical music. Guests screamed and dove for cover as the ballroom erupted into chaos, with Victoria's legitimate security personnel engaging the assassins who had been masquerading as hotel staff. Marcus shielded Emma with his body while Victoria's security team surrounded them, creating a human barrier between the child and the gunfire that was transforming the elegant ballroom into a war zone. They moved quickly through the service corridor, while behind them the charity gala dissolved into a firefight that would dominate news coverage for weeks. "Safe room is on the 20th floor," one of Victoria's security agents reported through his radio. "Elevator secured, stairwell secured, we have clear egress." As they rode the elevator towards safety, Victoria held Emma tightly while studying Marcus with an expression that combined gratitude with calculating assessment. "Mr. Thompson, you've risked your life to protect my daughter, and now you've saved us all by warning me about the assassination team. I want to know everything about how you found Emma and what you've learned about the people who are trying to destroy my family." Marcus looked at Emma, who was pressed against her mother's shoulder with her eyes closed, probably trying to block out the sounds of violence that had shattered her reunion with the person she loved most in the world. The little girl who had trusted him during the worst moments of her life deserved to know that the nightmare was finally over. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said quietly, "your daughter is the bravest person I've ever met. She survived 2 days of hell because she believed that you would come for her. Don't let the people who tried to kill her destroy the faith she has in you." Victoria Sterling nodded with the determination of someone who had decided to fight for something more important than money or power. The conspiracy that had tried to murder Emma was about to discover that they had awakened the protective instincts of a mother who controlled resources that could reshape entire governments. The war for Emma's life had just begun. But for the first time since Marcus found her in that abandoned building, he believed that she might actually survive it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.